My name is Angela, and I never imagined that day would be my last, or that death wouldn't be the end. The morning began like any other winter morning, cold, still, and quiet. The sun had barely broken the horizon, casting a pale light over the frozen world. Trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with frost, while the streets shimmered under a thick layer of ice. Everything felt untouched, frozen in time. I pulled my coat tighter around me as I stepped outside, my breath forming soft clouds in the crisp air. The neighborhood was silent, still caught in the drowsy grasp of dawn. The only sound was the faint crunch of ice beneath my boots. My mind was already occupied, thinking of errands, phone calls, and the endless to-do list waiting for me. Just another morning, just another routine, nothing out of the ordinary. And then, it happened. One misstep, a slip too quick to react. One moment, I was walking toward my car, my keys gripped tightly in my gloved hand. The next, the ground was gone. I had no time to brace myself, no way to stop what was coming. My body lurched backward, weightless for an instant. Then my head struck the pavement. A sharp pain exploded through my skull, but it lasted only a second. The world around me blurred, the sky twisted, its pale glow flickering like a candle in the wind. My ears rang, and then everything went silent. The freezing cold that had numbed my skin only moments ago was gone. The pain in my head vanished. The weight of my body, the feeling of the hard pavement beneath me, all of it disappeared in an instant. I was gone. I should have been afraid. I should have felt panic, confusion, something, anything, but I didn't. Instead, a warmth unlike anything I had ever known enveloped me. It wasn't just a sensation, like stepping into a heated room after being out in the cold. It was something deeper, more complete. It filled every part of me, wrapping around me as if I were being embraced by something greater than myself. It wasn't just comfort, it was peace. A kind of peace so pure and overwhelming that it left no room for fear. I opened my eyes, and the world I had known was gone. I was somewhere else. At first, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. There were no familiar landmarks, no frozen pavement, no grey winter sky. Instead, light, not like sunlight, not like artificial bulbs, but something alive. It wasn't harsh or blinding, yet it illuminated everything. It was everywhere, surrounding me, filling the very space itself. Yet there were no shadows, no darkness, only this radiant glow that seemed to pulse with life. And as I stood there, weightless, breathless, yet completely whole, I realized I wasn't just seeing the light. I was feeling it. It wasn't just around me, it was within me. I took a step forward, but it wasn't like walking on solid ground. There was no weight to my movements, no strain, no resistance. I wasn't floating, and yet I wasn't bound by gravity. I felt free in a way I had never experienced before, as if every limitation I had once known had been lifted. No heaviness, no pain, no fatigue. I wasn't just standing in this place. I was a part of it. Then I felt it, a presence. There were no footsteps, no sound to announce that someone was near. But I knew, without a doubt, I was not alone. It was as if the very space around me carried an awareness, a knowing, like the atmosphere itself was alive with it. And with that realization, the warmth surrounding me grew stronger, deeper, filling me with something beyond peace. Love. Not just any love, but a love so vast, so consuming, that it reached into the deepest parts of me. I turned, and there he was. I had never seen him before, not like this, but I knew him. There was no doubt, no hesitation. The moment my eyes met his, something within me recognized him instantly. Not from pictures, not from sermons, not from the stories I had heard throughout my life, but from something deeper, something my soul had always known. He stood before me, watching me, his expression calm, yet filled with something indescribable. Love, yes, but more than that, understanding, a kind of knowing that stripped away every pretense, every hidden part of me. He saw me, all of me, every thought, every failure, every moment of joy, every regret, and yet there was no judgment in his gaze, only love. There was no fear in his presence, no shame, no sense of unworthiness, only complete and absolute belonging. Jesus. I had spent my entire life believing in him, praying to him, speaking his name, but standing here now, I realized that nothing, no words, no teachings, no earthly experience could have ever prepared me for this moment. It wasn't just about seeing him. It was about knowing him as he truly was, not as an idea, not as a distant figure, but as the one who had always been with me, even when I didn't realize it. Every part of me was laid bare before him, not in a way that made me feel exposed or ashamed, but in a way that made me realize just how deeply he had always known me. He had seen every struggle, every doubt, every mistake I had ever made, and yet his love for me remained unchanged. There was no disappointment in his eyes, no condemnation, only a love so pure, so absolute, that it made every other love I had ever known feel small in comparison. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to ask where I was, what was happening, why I was standing before him, instead of waking up in a hospital somewhere. But before I could form the words, he lifted his hand, just slightly, and in that moment, something passed between us. Not in words, not in sound, but in understanding. I didn't need to ask where I was, because I already knew. I had died, but death was not what I had expected. It wasn't an end. It wasn't darkness. It wasn't nothingness. It was something more, a transition, a crossing from one existence to another. And yet, as I stood there in the radiance of his presence, I felt something else, a weight, not on my body, but in the air itself, as if something significant was about to happen, as if this moment was not the end of my journey, but the beginning of something else. Jesus looked at me, and for the first time, I noticed something in his eyes that I hadn't expected. Sorrow, not for himself, not for where I was, but for me, for all of us. There was love, yes, there was peace, but behind it, a deep, aching sadness. It wasn't disappointment. It wasn't anger. It was the sorrow of someone who had given everything and watched as so many still didn't understand. And before I could ask why, he spoke. There is something you need to see. The moment the words left his lips, everything around me shifted. The light that surrounded us didn't disappear, but it dimmed slightly, as if something else was taking shape before me. And in an instant, the world I had just left behind came into view. I wasn't in that peaceful place anymore. I was somewhere else, and what I saw next would change everything I thought I knew. The world around me looked familiar, and yet something was different. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary day. I saw people moving through their lives, cities filled with movement, families gathering, communities coming together. But the more I watched, the more I realized something was deeply wrong. There was a weight in the air, a heaviness that clung to everything, even in places where people smiled, laughed, went about their daily routines. There was something beneath the surface, something no one seemed to notice, or maybe something they had chosen to ignore. Jesus stood beside me, watching, waiting. At first, I didn't understand. Everything looked normal. I saw churches filled with worshippers, voices lifted in praise, hands raised in prayer. But as I looked closer, I saw what he already knew. The unity they spoke of was only an illusion. Beneath the songs and the sermons, hearts were divided. People stood side by side, yet miles apart in spirit. I saw believers who claimed to follow the same God, yet refused to love one another. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a problem in the world. It was a problem in the church. I watched as people gathered in places of worship, lifting their voices in prayer, reading the same scriptures, speaking of love and unity. But even within those sacred walls, there were invisible barriers. I saw congregations that claimed to be one body in Christ, yet remained separated by race, by culture, by unspoken lines that divided them more than they realized. They preached about forgiveness, yet held grudges in their hearts. They spoke about love, yet judged their neighbors in silence. They stood together in name, but not in spirit. And Jesus, he saw it all. They do not see each other as I see them, he said, his voice filled with sorrow. I turned to him, feeling the weight of those words press into my soul. Why? I asked. His expression didn't change. They have forgotten who they were, forgotten who he was, forgotten that his sacrifice was not just for some, but for all. I turned back to the scene before me, and as I watched, I saw something that made my chest tighten. It wasn't just a vision, it was blindness. People truly believed they were walking in righteousness, yet they had lost sight of what mattered most. I saw people clinging to their identities, not as children of God, but as members of their own groups. They defined themselves by their nationality, by their race, by their status, by their affiliations, as if those things made them who they were, and because of that, they saw others, not as brothers and sisters, but as strangers, as outsiders, as different. I saw pain passed down through generations, old wounds that had never truly healed. Some held on to their suffering, allowing it to turn into resentment. Others ignored the pain of the past, refusing to acknowledge the scars it had left behind. And in the midst of it all, I saw a world that was blind to the very thing that could heal it, him. Jesus stood beside me, silent, yet I could feel his sorrow as he watched. It wasn't just that people were divided, it was that they had accepted it as normal. They had allowed the world to tell them who they were, to dictate their worth, to define their relationships. They had let history shape their future, instead of letting his love reshape their hearts. And the enemy, he had been watching too. He had whispered lies into their ears for generations, convincing them that they were too different, too wounded, too far apart to ever be one. And because of that, people had stopped trying. Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite describe. It was love. It was pain. It was urgency. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of what he was about to show me next. The world around us shifted again, and suddenly, I was no longer just looking at division. I was seeing its consequences. I saw relationships broken, friendships torn apart by things that should never have mattered. I saw entire families fractured, not by death or distance, but by ideology, by resentment, by an unwillingness to see beyond their own experiences. I saw people who had spent their entire lives building walls, believing they were protecting themselves, when in reality, they were imprisoning themselves. Then I saw something even more heartbreaking. Even within the churches, even among those who claimed to know him, there was fear. Fear of speaking the truth, fear of confronting division, fear of acknowledging the pain that had been allowed to fester for too long. Some avoided the conversation altogether, pretending it wasn't there, believing that if they ignored it, it would simply go away. Others fed the fire, using anger as their weapon, using history as their justification for more pain, more distance, more hatred. And in the middle of it all, I saw what Jesus had been trying to show me from the very beginning, that the enemy's greatest weapon against humanity was not war, was not violence, was not power. It was division. I felt the weight of this truth settled deep in my spirit. The enemy didn't need to destroy people with force. He only needed to convince them to destroy each other, to see each other as enemies instead of family, to let wounds go unhealed, to let resentment fester in silence, to replace love with fear and unity with isolation. And the most devastating part, it was working. I turned to Jesus, my heart heavy. Can it be changed? I asked. His eyes met mine, filled with a love so vast, yet carrying an urgency I could not ignore. They must remember who they are, he said simply. They must return to me. The answer wasn't just about recognizing the problem. It wasn't just about admitting that division existed. It was about going back to the truth, back to the only thing that could heal what had been broken. People had spent so much time looking at one another through the lens of the world, through history, through pain, through differences, that they had stopped looking at each other through the eyes of God, and until that changed, nothing else would. The vision shifted again, and suddenly, time itself seemed to unravel before my eyes. I saw history unfolding like the pages of a book, flipping too quickly to grasp any single moment completely. Yet I understood everything that was happening. I saw the rise and fall of civilizations, the shaping of nations, and the way humanity had divided itself over and over again. At first, I saw beauty, people working together, creating, building, thriving. But then, I saw chains. I saw oppression. I saw families torn apart, lives stolen, freedom taken away. I saw history repeating itself, generation after generation, as pain was passed down, as division was sown deeper, as wounds were left open, never allowed to heal. Jesus stood beside me, watching, and his sorrow was almost too much to bear. They were meant to love one another, Jesus said, his voice quiet, yet filled with immeasurable grief. But they chose fear instead. I continued to watch as history moved forward, the faces and places changing, yet the cycle remained the same. Some were forced into suffering, stripped of dignity, treated as less than human. Others held on to power, clinging to the belief that their status made them more. But no one was truly free, because hatred enslaves both the oppressor and the oppressed. I continued watching as history moved forward. The names and faces changed, the nations rose and fell, but the pattern remained the same. I saw people who had been stripped of their dignity, forced into suffering, treated as less than human. I saw others clinging to power, afraid to let go, afraid to admit the sins of the past. But what struck me most was that no one was truly free, because hatred enslaves both the oppressor and the oppressed. I saw leaders rise, some speaking for truth, for justice, for healing, but others, they used division as a tool. Some were political, convincing people that their survival depended on keeping others beneath them. Some were religious, twisting scripture to justify their prejudices, using faith as a weapon instead of a path to redemption. And the enemy, he was behind it all, whispering into their ears, turning pain into rage, turning wounds into weapons, turning differences into reasons for war. I wanted to look away, to shut my eyes to the pain, to the suffering that had been repeated for generations. But I couldn't, because Jesus wasn't looking away. He had seen every injustice, every act of cruelty, every moment of oppression, and he had wept for them. He had never ignored the suffering of the world. He had never turned away from the wounds humanity inflicted on itself. But now, he was showing me the truth that so many refused to see. The past had left scars, yes, wounds that ran deep, pain that had shaped entire generations. But what people had failed to understand was that the answer was never in division. It was never in hatred. It was never in vengeance. The only way forward was through him. I turned to Jesus, my heart heavy. How do they fix this? I asked. How do they undo what has already been done? His expression didn't change. They must return to me, he said simply. Only my love can heal what the world has broken. It wasn't just about acknowledging the past. It wasn't about rewriting history or pretending it never happened. It was about choosing love despite it, choosing unity over resentment, choosing forgiveness over bitterness, choosing him above all else. The vision shifted again. And suddenly, I wasn't just watching history. I was seeing people as Jesus saw them, not as divided races, not as opposing nations, not as enemies, but as souls. And in that moment, I understood something I had never fully grasped before. There were no divisions in God's eyes, no hierarchies, no chosen ones and forgotten ones. Every person carried the same worth, the same light, the same imprint of their Creator. Then I saw the pain. I saw the wounds, not physical, but spiritual. Some bore scars passed down through generations. scars of oppression, scars of rejection, scars of injustice. Others carried burdens of guilt, the weight of sins committed long before they were even born, the fear of being blamed for things they did not do. Some had tried to heal, only to be pushed away. Some had tried to listen, only to be told they would never understand. And Jesus, he felt all of it. He had never turned away from those who suffered. He had stood in their pain. He had walked through their oppression. He had seen every injustice with his own eyes. But he had also seen the walls that pain had built. Some used their suffering as a shield, keeping others at a distance, refusing to let go of the anger that had become a part of them. Others lived in silence, afraid to speak, afraid to acknowledge the past, afraid of saying the wrong thing. And all of it, the pain, the guilt, the fear, had become chains that bound them, chains that only he could break. I understood then. The answer wasn't to ignore race, to pretend history hadn't happened, to act as though the pain of the past had no effect on the present. But the answer also wasn't to stay trapped in it. It wasn't to hold on to anger. It wasn't to let bitterness decide the future. It wasn't to divide even further in the name of justice. The answer was him. Only his love could heal what the world had broken. I saw, for the first time, how the enemy had twisted race into a weapon, how he had taken something God created as beautiful, diversity, culture, uniqueness, and turned it into something that caused pain, separation, hatred, instead of people seeing their differences as reflections of God's creativity. They had been taught to see them as barriers, as excuses to remain apart, as reasons to elevate some and reject others. And I realized how much time humanity had wasted fighting battles that God never intended them to fight. Jesus never created one race to be superior to another. He never intended for one people to stand above the rest. Every human being had been made with the same love, with the same purpose, to know him, to love one another. But over time, that truth had been lost. It had been buried beneath centuries of division, pain, fear, and lies. And now, Jesus was showing me what could happen if people finally chose to see each other the way he saw them. I saw something shift. People began reaching for one another, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in love. I saw walls that had stood for generations, cracked and crumbling. I saw forgiveness, not just words, not just forced gestures, but true, deep, and complete forgiveness. I saw people who had carried resentment for years, for decades, for lifetimes, suddenly letting go. It was as if they had been holding on to chains they never realized were wrapped around their hearts. And in an instant, those chains shattered. I saw those who had suffered injustice, choosing to move forward, not by forgetting, not by pretending the past didn't exist, but by refusing to let it control them any longer. I saw people embracing, weeping together, breaking down barriers that had once felt impossible to cross. It wasn't shallow, it wasn't performative, it was real, because it wasn't something the world had orchestrated. It wasn't because of a law, or a policy, or a movement. It was because hearts had been changed, not by force, not by obligation, but by Jesus. He stood beside me, watching, his expression full of love. "This is what I desire," he said, "that they love one another." And I realized this had been his desire all along, not for people to ignore the past, not for them to erase history, but for them to see one another through his eyes, not through the lens of pain, not through the weight of division, but through the truth of his love. I saw churches uniting, not because they were told to, not because it was expected, but because they finally saw each other as family. There were no longer separate places of worship for different groups, no unspoken rules keeping people apart. Instead, people gathered, not under a flag, not under a denomination, not under a cultural identity, but under him. There was no longer us and them, only one body, one people, one church. They weren't divided by race. They weren't separated by history. They were simply God's children, standing together, worshipping together, living together in unity. It was something so simple, and yet the world had made it seem impossible. The enemy had spent generations convincing people that unity could never happen, that their pain was too great to heal, that their differences were too vast to overcome. But Jesus was showing me the truth. What the world said was impossible had always been possible through him. I saw families teaching their children not to inherit the chains of division. I saw parents telling their sons and daughters that hatred did not have to be their legacy, that they didn't have to carry resentment, that they didn't have to pass down wounds that Jesus had already healed. I saw young people choosing to live differently, choosing to build something new, something that looked like heaven on earth. This is how they move forward. Jesus said, not by ignoring what has happened, but by choosing love despite it. I felt the weight of his words settle deep into my spirit. For so long, the world had taught people that moving forward meant either pretending the past didn't exist or using it as a reason to stay divided. But neither of those things led to healing. Real healing didn't come from forgetting. It came from acknowledging the pain and choosing love anyway. It came from recognizing the wounds, but refusing to let them define the future. It came from understanding that justice was not found in revenge, but in redemption. I saw people reaching across divides that had once seemed impossible to cross. I saw churches inviting one another in, no longer seeing themselves as separate groups, but as one body in Christ. I saw people no longer defining themselves by their past, their culture, or their differences, but simply by their identity as children of God. And then, I saw something even more powerful. I saw leaders choosing truth over fear. Not just church leaders, not just pastors, but political leaders, teachers, community voices, people who had once been afraid to speak about unity because they didn't want to offend anyone, people who had once remained silent because they didn't know how to approach the conversation. I saw them standing up, declaring what Jesus had always wanted: love, unity, reconciliation, not as theories, not as hopeful ideas, but as a way of life. For too long, people had been afraid to talk about division, afraid to acknowledge history, afraid to face the pain. Some avoided it entirely, pretending it wasn't there, while others used it to stir more anger, more bitterness, more pain. But now, I saw people who were no longer afraid. They weren't afraid to say that injustice had happened. They weren't afraid to admit that wounds had been inflicted. But they also weren't afraid to say that the world's way of solving division had failed, and that the only way forward was through Jesus. I saw revival, not the kind that fills church pews for a night, but the kind that transforms hearts forever. It wasn't just happening in churches. It was happening in homes, in schools, in governments, in entire communities. It wasn't about religion. It wasn't about following traditions. It was about people waking up, realizing that they had spent too long letting the enemy keep them apart, letting history dictate their future, letting bitterness hold them back from the freedom Jesus had already paid for. And then, I saw something even more powerful. I saw people truly listening to one another, not listening to argue, not listening to defend themselves, but listening to understand. I saw people willing to hear the pain of others without becoming defensive. I saw those who had suffered finally finding peace in the fact that their pain was acknowledged. I saw those who had been misunderstood finally being given the chance to show their hearts. People weren't looking at each other as oppressors or victims, as enemies or threats. They were looking at each other as brothers and sisters. This was how healing began, not by erasing the past, but by choosing not to let it control the present. Jesus turned to me again, his eyes full of love, but also filled with the same urgency as before. They must not wait for the world to tell them when to love, he said. They must choose love now. I felt the weight of his words settle deep into my spirit. He wasn't just showing me what could be, he was showing me what must be. It wasn't enough for people to hope for unity. It wasn't enough for them to say the right things in public, while holding on to resentment in private. They had to make the choice to forgive, to love, to heal, to walk forward, together as one. And in that moment, I knew this was why he had sent me back. Everything around me shifted in an instant. The vision of people uniting, the overwhelming love of Jesus, the hope that had filled my soul. It all faded as I felt something pulling me away. It wasn't sudden or violent, but it was undeniable. It was as if I was being drawn backward, away from the presence of Jesus, away from the place where I had seen so much truth. I turned to him, desperate to hold on, to stay just a little longer. There was so much more I wanted to understand, so much I hadn't asked. But before I could speak, Jesus met my eyes with a look of deep love and unwavering certainty. "Go back," he said. "Tell them." His voice was gentle, but there was a weight behind it that left no room for hesitation. This wasn't a request. This was a mission, a command. Before I could even respond, before I could ask how, everything around me collapsed into darkness. The warmth disappeared, the light faded, the peace that had surrounded me just moments ago was gone. And then I gasped for air. The cold hit me like a wave, sharp and unforgiving. My lungs burned as they struggled to pull in oxygen, my chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Every part of my body ached. My head throbbed. As I became aware of the solid ground beneath me, the world around me felt heavy, too real, too harsh. After where I had just been, I wasn't in that heavenly place anymore. I was back. A voice called my name, distant at first, then growing clearer. Someone was shaking me, their hands gripping my shoulders, their panicked breaths visible in the freezing air. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Angela, oh my God, are you okay?" I recognized the voice, but it took me a moment to place it. It was my neighbor, the one who had seen me lying motionless on the ground and had rushed to my side. I tried to speak, but my lips felt numb, my body still trying to catch up with my spirit. "You weren't breathing," she said, her voice shaky. I thought. She stopped, swallowing hard. "I called an ambulance. Just stay still." I wasn't sure what to say. How could I explain what had just happened? How could I tell her that I had seen Jesus, that I had left this world entirely, that I had been given a message so urgent, that he had sent me back? I didn't have time to process any of it. The sirens were already approaching, flashing lights reflecting off the icy pavement. As the paramedics arrived, I was lifted onto a stretcher, questions being thrown at me, voices overlapping. They checked my pulse, my breathing, shining a light into my eyes, trying to understand how I had survived a fall like that, how I had gone without oxygen and was still here, fully conscious. But even as they spoke to me, even as they wrapped me in blankets and tried to keep me awake, all I could think about was what I had just left behind. I had died. I had stood before Jesus. I had seen the truth about the world, about humanity, about the way forward. And now I was back. The ride to the hospital was a blur. I answered what little I could, saying I had slipped on the ice, that I had lost consciousness, that I didn't remember much after the fall. It was easier than trying to explain what had really happened. No one would believe me if I told them the truth. Not yet, at least. Lying in that hospital bed later, staring up at the ceiling, I felt different. It wasn't just that I had survived something that should have killed me. It was that I wasn't the same person who had fallen that morning. Something inside me had shifted. I could feel it in every part of me, a knowing so deep that it felt like it had been written into my very soul. I had been sent back for a reason. Jesus had told me to tell them. But tell them what? How could I even begin to put into words what I had seen? Lying there, staring at the fluorescent lights above me, I whispered the words to myself, letting them settle into my spirit. I will tell them. And I knew, without a doubt, I knew this was only the beginning.